Welcome to the Brand Together podcast. Join host Brett Ryan to dive deep and go behind the scenes of successful brand partnerships. Featuring pros from every industry and vertical, from mega brands to startups and everything in between. The Brand Together podcast is essential listening for anyone interested in learning more about brand partnerships. Are you ready? Let's dive in.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Brand Together podcast. My name is Brett Ryan, and I'm joined today by Wang. He's currently an internal strategist at a big tech company whose name you've heard of. He was previously a strategic consultant at Accenture, and Hall and I, we go way back. We know each other actually through our MBA program. During that program, Hall did marketing and sales internships at Blue Origin and Facebook. And today we're going to be talking about brand partnerships through the perspective of someone who does business strategy. Hall, go ahead and say hi. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hey everyone. I'm a classmate of Brett's. It was an interesting 2 years. And my big thing is that since graduation, I've been a business strategist. So what that really comes down to is I think about just businesses making their strategic objectives. First of all, like what are their strategic objectives? A lot of times that's financial related. And how do they get there? And I think this is a really relevant conversation for me because I'm thinking a lot more about how brand partnerships are just a very strong ingredient to get to the financial objectives. It's something I've been thinking a lot of lately. It's just the roles celebs, influencers, and creators place and brand and the partnership around brands.
Hall, from where you sit at the business strategy table, one thing I'm sure you see a lot is these various, creator brands, influencer brands, celebrity brands, even folks with personal brands, right? Maybe you see like a prominent business leader. For example, if you're the CEO of Netflix or Facebook, or you have any kind of personal brand in the media, it crosses this bridge into actually being a small celebrity brand or a legitimate celebrity brand all on its own. And you see a lot of these folks invoke brand partnerships as part of their brand building strategy. And so I guess just right off the jump, a question I want to ask you is, if I am thinking about my own personal brand, at what point do brand partnerships in your mind become a legitimate or valuable tactic for these folks to pursue?
Kind of think about it like a relationship or dating. There has to be a story behind the match. And the match goes two ways. So for a person who is like the creator or celebrity, what do they offer? And one big thing I think about is audience. Like how large is your audience? Who is their audience? And what is the messaging or what do they project? And for the person on the other end or brand on the other end, how can they gain from that audience? What's the relevance? What's the connection? One thing I think a lot strategically, obviously financials matter, but a baseline, is there what people in the industry call a strategic fit? But I like to call it authenticity.
Sure.
Or a lot of times just, is it believable that two brands will come together and have a connection on both sides of the aisle, no pun intended. So
that's a great point. I feel like consumers can tell. I think they've got a really good radar for the most part, right? Like if I'm a brand strategist and I'm encouraging my celebrity client to pursue a particular partnership or an endorsement, I think consumers, their radar on that kind of thing has improved significantly. I'm sure there's still an opportunity to fool and you can still fake it till you make it a little bit. With social media, my perception is that consumers will hold those celebrity brands oftentimes even more accountable than like company brands, like social media influencers, right? If they do a partnership that lacks authenticity, you can almost bet money that there will be folks in their comments section saying, hey, sellout or what's going on. Like they'll point it out pretty directly, has been my observation.
I think it's easy to think about when things go wrong or when things blow up because it's so inauthentic or so awkward.
Yeah.
Obviously, that does happen. That's what makes news. That's what makes business school classes. But I think on a more basic level, there's just a lack of return on investment. At a certain point, there's a fair amount of leeway. It could be somebody, a celebrity could not be connected to a brand whatsoever, but they have the logo on an Instagram post or whatnot. It's going to have more return on investment in terms of creating awareness and creating brand favorability if there is a more genuine connection. If there isn't, a more baseline level of, I don't want to call it harm, but lack of impact is the lack of gains from the customer side in terms of expanding your customer base or the audience that might potentially be customers. I think that's the more superficial challenge.
We touched on it a little bit earlier, but could you give me an example of a celebrity brand partnership you really loved and then help us understand what, in your mind, distinguishes a great celebrity brand partnership versus one that's just ho-hum or so-so?
So this will reveal how I'm old or older. But in 2013, before I met in business school, I lived in Nashville, Tennessee, one of the most fun parts of my life. And, and honestly, what I saw was something I'll never forget when it comes to marketing in general, but in particular brand partnerships. But I went to Taylor Swift's 2013 concert in Nashville at Firestone Arena. And for the Swifties out there, it was part of her Red album tour or the Red era.
Mhm.
And plastered all over the concert venue and everything was Coca-Cola. It was the brand sponsor. I don't know if the official brand sponsor, but it was a very major brand sponsor. And yes, Coke is everywhere, obviously. They do lots of brand sponsorships. But I want to really highlight like why this was so good and not just another random Coke sponsorship run the mill. Like I said, this is the Red era. For those who aren't Swifties, there was a lot of red, everything from her lipstick to her outfit, the color of the concert. And Coke is packaged red. So there's an emotional connection towards Taylor Swift and Coca-Cola. And the one thing we think about, it, like it mentions, authenticity. What's the relevance for Taylor Swift fans and Coke, the drink? And you have to remember back then, 2013, her concert goers, I was an outlier, but her concert goers are mostly teens to people in their early 20s. Now in her latest concert, like teens to 40s, but most people are teens, and Nashville being a little bit more of a conservative town, they couldn't drink alcohol. So if they need something else to drink that give them energy to last the concert. Of course, Coca-Cola is just a nice fit. And also, let's think about Taylor Swift herself back then. She was back then more of a whole portraying image of being wholesome girl doing songs about life, about high schooler person in her early 20s and growing up. And that wholesome image just matches really well with a certain all-American sense of being a younger person, just drinking Coke, again, non-alcoholic, and just having a good time and being energized. And the coloring connection, it was just so perfectly done in terms of just imagery, relevance, authenticity, and just thematic connections.
I love that. And what an observation. One of the brand partnerships that I've enjoyed looking at recently was actually Bud Light partnered a few years ago with a host of musical artists to do their dive bar tour. I think maybe the most prominent of which was Post Malone. And what you mentioned about the non-visual alignment or the hedonic alignment, it's, hey, this is not alcohol. Audience demographic is pre-adolescents and teenagers, this younger crowd. Taylor Swift herself, had she entered the pop era then? Maybe just barely, right?
Barely. She's still mostly country or good. I was like in between.
Yeah. It's so funny because some musical artists, when they make a big genre change, look at Miley Cyrus when she moved out of her country phase, was almost immediately like a little more racy, a little more explicit in her content. But your observations there about the alignment of the non-visual elements of the brand, I love that. That's great. Here's a question for you I randomly thought of. So Taylor Swift, she's good at this stuff too, right? Why do you think that some celebrity brands are better at this than others? What do the Taylor Swifts understand and do differently than, say, I can't even think of one off the top of my head, but perhaps I can't think of a disaster necessarily, but some of the less perfectly aligned brand partnerships. What do you think they understand intuitively that makes them different?
I think there's two things. One is within media or celebrity culture to a certain extent, there's just this sense of needing to push the edge and be edgy and just reinvent yourself. And that's all relevant. That's all true. But I think what Taylor has done is that she has reinvented herself on her terms to be authentic to not only her life, but just something that parallels her audience,
Mm,
which is, for a good chunk of it, is women growing up in America, coming of age
yep.
in their teens, 20s. Now she's 33, 30, something like that. And that coming of age in a very natural, not trying to be too like ostentatious or to just a little bit outlandish type of way, just resonates with a lot of people. So that's just like her story in self-brand management is really good. But then the second is there's a fair amount of curation of what she like, how she manages her public image.
Sure.
And obviously, I don't want to get detailed. She has landed in some minor controversies or
Yep.
whatnot, but by and large, she's really managed her brand and what she stands really well. And she's got lucky a few times. But I would say her boyfriend pick, whether it's luck or
Yeah.
that, it's just landed in her favor for her connecting her brand.
It's interesting, this observation that I make this, I sometimes joke just in my personal conversations, like you see this happen a lot with like bands, like musicians, right? Where they start off with a particular identity. And the joke I have is like on a long enough timeline, like every band becomes political, right? But like Green Day, for example, started as punk and then pop punk and then politics, right? You could argue that there's other examples, right? And of course, it's not a universally applicable rule, but it's like, all right, if you have nowhere else to go with your brand identity, you can always make a political statement, right? And contrast that with what we're talking about here, where Taylor Swift's brand had an evolution, but she was very deliberate about it, right? And said, hey, this is the way I'm going to evolve. It wasn't just turning over a new leaf for a fresh breath of relevancy in the larger cultural conversation, right? It was a legitimate, we thought through this, we're making a deliberate evolution that aligns with my values, or at least the values I purport to have publicly. And it was a deliberate thing. And just getting really clear about what your brand stands for, what you represent, and owning in on that rather than just leaving it to chance, right? Or letting the rest of the world or even your current fans tell you who you are, being deliberate about it and saying, no, this is who I am. And I love that. The other thought I had is we just got done talking about how effective Taylor Swift is at brand partnerships. And I would imagine a good part of it is because she understands her own brand so well, right? We talked about the beauty of the Coke partnership and why it works and what she understood about her audience and what she was trying to put forward. My question is to you, is there a certain threshold or line that you think celebrity brands need to cross or should cross before they start considering part? Is there like a soft or hard rule where you as a professional, if you're working with a celebrity or a brand partner, what are the differences between those celebrity brands that you would say, look, hey, listen, I strongly recommend you start thinking about brand partnerships. Here's my thoughts. Here's some direction on that. Versus a celebrity brand where you see him and you're like, maybe not. What's the difference? What are the qualitative, quantitative differences between a celebrity brand that is ready for brand partnerships versus one that should just take that same commensurate amount of time, effort, resources, etc., and invest it in something else?
I first start off with what is the celebrity or influencer's audience, and who is the audience? Where is the audience? And then, first of all, just understand those dynamics. That's the starting point. And then within that audience, what are the brand partnerships available? And you have, it's like going to a supermarket. If you're going for like salmon, for example, and all that they're offering is tuna, then it's probably not a good fit because it doesn't project the type of brand image that you want in terms of potential brand sponsorships. Based off that, who are the people that are willing to have a partnership with you? Yes, a lot of times things just don't have the return on investment, but you want to think future forward. You want to think about, hey, if you do a relationship with one brand, is that good for your future brand itself and also future brand sponsorships? Everybody has to manage their own aspirations versus their desire for income flow versus the opportunities out there. But there's a certain art of balancing, essentially making money now versus making money later when the brand is a different place or has a greater audience. So what I ultimately get back to is I think about, like, in that situation, what is the right thing to say yes to? And that's like the perfect scenario, and perfect scenario which has sufficient investment that you want, but also helps with both the individual's personal brand or celebrity brand, and then helps with future brand sponsorships. And then based off what the market has available, then is this stuff you want to say yes to, or is this stuff you want to say no to? In some ways, it's a lot like career planning. If you take this job now, is this what you want to get to in the future? And what's all in it versus your own personal needs, personal wants, and then professional goals, so on and so forth. And then one last thing I want to caveat is that at a certain point, celebrities, influencers, creators, they're people. They have beliefs, they have expectations that they want to stand up for. And there is this individual aspect of it. So if they are more of a fan of something, they're more likely to want to gravitate towards it versus when they're less interested.
I love that. You brought up a couple interesting points. I just want to highlight and walk back a little bit. I love your comparison to career planning for like decisions to engage in a brand partnership or not. And the way I'm interpreting that is your typical celebrity brand will have a variety of brand partnership opportunity. And you could apply this to like a small business brand or really any brand. You could apply the same idea. But there's this idea that you'll have brand partnership opportunities, and there are brand partnerships that help you build and really help you develop your own brand in the direction you want it to go, right? That you feel strongly about. And then there's probably other brand partnership opportunities along the way that maybe they're not destructive or antithetical to your brand, but maybe they're a little bit more dilutive than some of these other opportunities that make like the perfect sense in terms of strategic alignment. And maybe there's a lot of zeros or big dollar signs attached to some of those opportunities. And so you've got to make that planning decision of, and this is probably not the terms in which most folks think about it, but it's almost, okay, do I want to cash in some chips now, or do I want to keep building? And you see some celebrities who they'll cash in their chips. And I don't blame any of those people, right? But it's an interesting dynamic to think about. And you compared it to career planning, and it's okay. I just graduated high school. Do I run away to the oil fields and make as much money as I humanly can right now and cash out my chips, for example, right? Or is this a greater direction I want to build towards? Do I go to school or select jobs at certain companies that provide a certain trajectory, right? I love that idea because I do believe that you can be that deliberate and that tactical about it.
Yeah. And I think like a really good analogy that a lot of people might be able to help understand or relate to is think about the current college athletes in the era of name, image, likeness. They have to make a judgment call. Do they want to spend some more years playing college athletics in which you get brand partnerships for name, image, likeness, and they are a big fish in a small pond? Or they could try to go pro and, hey, look, not everyone's Caitlin Clark. They could try to go pro, assuming you're in a sport that does go pro, and there's a lot that aren't. And then you might have a bigger salary of NBA, obviously not WNBA, but then you're still the same size fish, but you're in a way bigger pond. And you have to compete with a lot of others for brand partnerships. And then you have to think about that versus timing, years of eligibility. And then there's the unknown factor. Will you get injured maybe you might want to do something else. All that comes into play.
Yeah. That also clarifies thinking, right? Really helps understand that trade-off. And like in a perfect world, there wouldn't be any trade-offs, but the reality is that there is oftentimes. And so, okay, I want to switch gears a little bit. And I don't want the objective here is not necessarily to be mean or disparaging or anything like that. But I'm just curious. I love asking people this question. I'm excited to hear your take on it, Hall. And this could be as a consumer or a business strategist or both. Have you seen or can you recall any brand partnerships that just strike you as being like objectively bad? Like you think about it and you're like, ooh, I remember that one. Any that stand out to you as this did not work out?
Yeah, it's funny. I actually talk about it with my friends quite a bit, just an everyday conversation. And what it is that the US Army, they had a brand partnerships with an actor. His name was Jonathan Majors.
Mm-hmm.
He was a brand ambassador for all their recruiting commercials. This was about a year ago. So before I explain more about this, I would just want to be fully transparent. I was in the Army for 8 years before business school.
Yep.
And, I had a good experience. I think very positively about my good experience. I'm still a fan of the institution, the people, and the memories I have. But I want to explain why it was like, in many ways, a terrible brand partnership.
Yep.
Or I think a very good organization. So now the brand partnership has been canceled for, I think, 2 or 3 months, a few months after they announced it. And that was because Jonathan Majors was arrested on domestic violence.
Yep.
And he's been since convicted for that or some parts of that. And obviously, no one wants to be associated with anything related to domestic violence, especially the Army, to go for upstanding citizen type folks.
Yep.
But now, let's just call that something like no one can predict, and let's just put that aside for the sake of analysis. And just thinking about brand partnerships, let's think about how even without considering that factor, it was just super awkward. I talk about having a strategic fit and authentic relevance. It simply isn't there. Most people join the Army are between the ages of 17 to 26. Yes, you have a 39, 41-year-old every now and then, but the most people that try to join are Gen Z. Mm-hmm. Jonathan Majors, when he was selected, was roughly around 33. And no offense to him, but he actually looks roughly 33.
Yeah.
So it doesn't really work to have a guy who looks older to try to convince Gen Z to join the Army. And then tied to authenticity, Jonathan Majors was never in the Army. And yes, he's an actor. So maybe hopefully playing people in the Army, or shall we say like the upstanding good guy that the Army likes to project. In his more famous movie roles, he was the bad guy. Great actor in the bad guy role. So in the Rocky movie, he was Damien, a bad guy. And then the Marvel movie, he was Kane the Conqueror, also a bad guy. He did play a good guy in his movies, and he was a not Army person, but Navy person. Mm-hmm. So not a great fit. But then let's think about, did it help create a large audience or create audience buzz? And think about this in terms of brand buzz. Was there a lot of discussion? Did it go viral on social media? And it didn't go viral in the positive way, but there was a lot of talk about like, why this guy? Was there a brand love? Did Jonathan Majors help make the Army more endearing or beyond what it was? And I didn't really see anything related to that. So just on all fronts, it was just not a great brand partnership. I understand what they were likely going for, which is, hey, here's a well-accomplished actor. He was a great actor who would want to do this, was a very action-oriented person in his roles, and that was a connection. But if you think about, take it one step deeper, regardless of the arrest, it just doesn't fit in so many ways.
Yep, that makes sense. I love how it all comes back to this idea of understanding your audience and what you'd like them to do, or really the product that you'd like to impart to them, for lack of a better term, right? And there are little pockets of inauthenticity all throughout, right? It's funny. I've never served in the military, just for full transparency. However, many of my friends and close family do. And one thing I've heard, I've got a close friend who is a full 4-star colonel, right? They were a colonel in the Army. And one thing he mentioned to me, he was enlisted before he became an officer, right? And one thing he mentioned to me is how far that got him as far as respect and understanding and authenticity with the troops he led. And there's like kind of a similar dynamic here where they're sniffing for that authenticity. Do we believe in what this guy's saying? Why would we give this particular individual respect in this level? Are we just going to let any old Hollywood actor come in here and tell us what to do? It's interesting because there are so many actors that actually do have military careers and make it part of their brand identity. One that comes to mind off the top of my head is Adam Driver. At least early on in his career, he made a big deal about it. Hey, I was in the service, and I don't know if that's so much the case if he makes such a big deal about it anymore, but I remember that was kind of one of my early footnotes about him. Morgan Freeman, I think, was in the military at some point. Anyway, the point is there's many of them. And to me, there's this idea of let's go with this partnership because they're the hot new thing. We just know they're big right now. Marvel's blowing up. He's the next Thanos, right? Let's just get him in there versus, as you mentioned, going a level deeper and performing that due diligence to make sure that all the non-visual elements of that brand partnership actually make sense.
Yeah. And a big part of it is if it doesn't look completely or have a good level of authenticity, then your desired results, even if it's not the best return on investment, it's probably not going to be there.
Yeah.
Chances are. Just a lot of times they say, hey, and not that it's always accurate, but if a person looks like they have their stuff together, they probably have their stuff together.
Yeah, that's a great point. And then the other thing too, we mentioned it briefly in passing, but I think it's worth discussing a little bit, is talk about a celebrity brand that fundamentally changed almost overnight, right? Just a morality clause in your contract is not always going to save you, right? Because things happen, and this happens with companies too, right? You don't have to look too far. Yeah, I would say it happens less often with companies, but sometimes a brand changes fundamentally overnight. The one that comes to the top of my head when I think about companies is think about FTX, right? And you remember they had they had that Super Bowl spot. They had all these celebrities, and I don't want to get too far into FTX, but that brand partnership, their brand equity fundamentally changed overnight. And we saw a similar thing happen to Jonathan Majors. And if your brand partnership is not as well executed as it could be, if a negative brand event like that happens, it's just going to fall out even worse. Army's doing fine, but I think they definitely had a little bit of egg on their face when things blew up. Oh, Army, domestic violence. So insert jokes about relationships between deployed service members and their wives and all the friction that can, anyways, I'm just riffing, but it's interesting to think about.
I think the key thing is that, just going back to what I said earlier, that a brand partnership is a partnership, and just like dating or a personal relationship, there needs to be a fair amount of knowledge on both sides and a fair amount of trust on both sides, or as in like for a relationship to have a high expectation of doing well together. So I think there's due diligence on both sides, making sure the celebrity influencer creator, they know them and they know the company and their sense of where their future is going.
Yeah.
Companies change too. Companies have trajectories. Companies have different hopes and dreams.
Yeah. And I would also insert, much like a marriage or relationship, it's like after the partnering event, you should ideally have a commitment to that partner, right? If I'm the US Army, one of the things I should be thinking about is, hey, the evolution of my brand, how is that going to reflect on my brand partners, right? If I'm Adam Driver or Jonathan Majors, or if I've got a small business brand and I'm taking on brand partnerships, ideally as a partner, just like a marriage partner or someone you're dating, ideally one of the things they consider is, how will my actions today or the direction I'm taking my brand or intend to take it, how will that reflect on my long-term partners, right? And I'm not suggesting that any business or celebrity brand should make their most important branding decisions directly from that frame of reference, right? However, I do believe it needs to be considered and it should be thought about deliberately as part of that process.
I think you bring up a really interesting point, is that the big difference between an individual being a brand versus a company. Your book, which I started listening to, talk about Lego and Exxon and their decade-long partnership. So that's between two companies. I would say the big difference is that brand partnerships with people, they generally speaking last a shorter amount of time. I think the famous like long-term brand partnership relationship case study is, I know it's Cindy Crawford. I think the company was Revlon. I could be wrong with that. And that lasted for a decade or two or something like that. A lot of brand partnerships with individuals, it's either fleeting. Hey, you do this one commercial, one episode, one social media post, and then you move on. Or there's a big advertising campaign, which lasts like at most like a year or two or things like that. So it's a shorter frame of thinking. And that matters because you have to think about, most people aren't Cindy Crawford. Most people, it's going to be, the vast majority is going to be for advertising campaign for a quarter or so, if less. And then where do you go from there? And then what are the future options beyond this brand?
Yeah, I love that. You're right. Paul, this has been great. I've enjoyed our conversation a lot. These ideas are certainly applicable in a lot of ways to celebrity brands and influencer brands. I want to bring it back down to earth for our listener audience, many of which own or operate a small brand themselves. And my question is, these observations we've been discussing in influencer, celebrity, creator brand partnerships, if I'm a small business owner or operator, how do these apply to me? What advice would you give to a small business owner who's trying to court brand partnerships themselves? They've got a small unknown brand or maybe a less prominent brand. What advice would you give to those folks?
First off, know who your customers are. And let's just say these are customers that can be appealed to whatever creator, brand, influencer, whatever type of relationships. Then maybe kind of think about what can you do to either get a recurrent customer, buy more, or have new customers like recurrent customers. Or you might want to get an entirely new segment, a new group of customers. So you have to reach out to them. And then let's just say you are a B2C small business. So you sell things that retail. There are lots of interesting, fun, location-oriented creators out there who a lot of times will do brand sponsorships, whether it's for a single Instagram post or YouTube video. I will take back one thing. I will say there are occasions where people do have multi-year brand relationships with a certain brand, but it's also like more newer. So we'll see how that unfolds. But there are definitely influencers who do have longer term relationships. You can have that as a small business as well. But there are lots of people in the local environment who will say, hey, I'm out for a run in Boston. And oh, this new shop just opened up. I'm wearing their goods. And here's a joke about the seaport in Boston. Or maybe you're not a clothing store. Maybe you are something less easy to understand, less tangible. And you want to explain yourself to people. There's YouTube channels that focus on deconstructing a certain topic. Let's say you are a mattress company. I think a mattress firm in 2022, they made or sponsored this branded podcast called Chasing Sleep. And you could Google it and there's research that lifted sales. So basically there's many ways to get a bite at the apple. My favorite is this influencer who basically tears apart shoes and analyzes, like, is it a good or bad shoe? And he takes a lot of shoes from newer manufacturers. And this all goes back to every business a little bit different. Every influencer is a little bit different. You have to evaluate on your own. But if you think about either a local context, or let's just say you're a small business that sells nationally, globally, if you can identify who your customers are, there are ways to go through creators, influencers, celebrities within your budget to reach out to your audience, new audience, so on and so forth.
It's interesting because it really comes back to understanding your own brand, understanding the hedonic elements of our brand, the non-visual elements of our brand, and by extension, understanding our customers. And if you really understand where the rubber meets the road there, it seems like it empowers you. It puts you in a position where you can be deliberate in a way that drives you towards success rather than just throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks. Sometimes throwing spaghetti works, but it often has some dilutive consequences.
I also want to say this, that not everyone is going to get everything perfectly on the first try.
That's a great
Part
point.
of the process is learning. And there's something to be said about, shall we say, less expensive brand partnerships to just try things out. And a lot of times from the data, you'll not only learn what didn't work, you'll see the bits and aspects of it that didn't work and just amplify that. I think the worst thing to get out of this is, hey, it's time to try a brand partnership with a creator. We did it 3 times, 2 times out of the 3, it didn't work. The 1 time has some minor impact. The right answer is not being like, okay, game over, try something new. It'll be like, well, the 1 time you got it right, what did you get right? And is that something you can expand upon, to learn upon? Because this goes back to everybody's a little bit different, and you got to understand where your differences matter and where maybe you need to re-strategize a bit.
You're brilliant. I've enjoyed your insights. Let's do it again soon. If you could leave our listener audience with any one thought or idea, here's your chance. What parting words of wisdom do you have for us?
I think the key thing is that brand matters for your business strategy. A lot of times, especially if you're a small organization, you're busy doing the day in, day outs or long-term strategic planning. Do think about brand, but yet you may or may not connect that to marketing. A lot of marketers think about brand. But what I'm ultimately wanting to emphasize that in order to achieve strategic goals, financial targets, how a company looks like, where a company is postured, brand needs to be part of the equation. And there are many ways for it to be involved in the equation. I'm just highlighting those creators, influencers, celebrities as one thing that's happening right now and something that anybody can make that happen and make it real. And it's a really real opportunity. And there are some ways to do it smarter, or shall we say, have better return on investment and avoid any risks or minimize risks. And I just want to have this be part of the conversation for anyone to think about in terms of managing their business, whether it's theirs or working in a big company. And I just want to connect that brand piece to the strategy piece. And most of all, I know Brett since grad school. You should read his book. I've listened to his book about brands. He has a really good voice, and it's a good experience. And hopefully you have some fun with that. And it's a good listen.
Thank you, Hall. Thanks for the shout out there. And I've really enjoyed having you on the podcast. I want to have you back. And I think you're absolutely right about the opportunity that small businesses have to think really deliberately about this kind of thing, right? It doesn't have to be this mystery, doesn't have to be a black box. And so I appreciate that. Thank you for joining us today. It's been a pleasure.
This has been another episode of the Brand Together podcast with your host, Brett Ryan. Join us next week for another deep dive into brand partnerships.